James stood at the edge of the community pool, the sun casting a golden glow over the sparkling water. It was the end of another long day, and the promise of solitude and relaxation lured him in. The gentle hum of the pool's filtration system and the occasional ripple of the water were the only sounds breaking the serene silence. As he peeled off his shirt, feeling the cool breeze against his skin, the weight of his workday seemed to melt away. This was his time, a perfect oasis amidst the chaos of life. He slipped into the water, the chill of it sending a shiver down his spine before the warmth of the late afternoon sun balanced it out. The deep blue pool stretched out in front of him, inviting and tranquil. There were a few scattered residents around, but the pool was mostly quiet, just the way he liked it. He floated on his back, his mind drifting as his body relaxed. In these moments, the world felt far away. James had always loved this feeling, the pure simplicity of being alone with his thoughts. But today, something felt different. From the corner of his eye, he saw a figure standing near the pool's edge, a woman with a clipboard, wearing an air of authority that instantly stood out against the casual, laid-back residents around her. Karen, the newly elected president of the Homeowners Association, stood surveying the pool with a sharp gaze, her posture rigid and purposeful. Her presence felt intrusive, out of place. She scanned the area as though every inch of the pool belonged to her, watching for something or someone to step out of line. James couldn't help but feel a small knot form in his stomach. He had heard whispers about her since her recent election. Karen had promised to make the community a better place, but something about her confident, almost domineering attitude made him uneasy. It was as if she believed she had the right to control everything and everyone around her. The soft murmur of conversations around the pool gradually faded as residents noticed her presence. It was clear she was making rounds, inspecting. James tried to shake off the growing tension, but it was hard not to notice the way Karen's eyes darted around, as if she were checking off an invisible list. She approached a group lounging by the edge and made a few comments about the pool towels being out of order. Her voice was sharp and commanding, her tone not asking but telling. James couldn't hear the exact words, but he saw the way the group shifted uncomfortably, their smiles fading as they nodded politely, shrinking beneath her gaze. The moment felt off. His instincts screamed that this wasn't just a casual walk through the pool area. Karen was in control, and from the way she carried herself, she intended to keep it that way. A sudden chill ran through him, and for the first time in a long while, the pool didn't feel like a peaceful retreat. It felt like a territory being claimed, the calmness of the water now tainted by an invisible force looming over it. James pushed the thought aside and swam a few laps, trying to ignore the prickling sensation along his spine. But as he turned at the deep end, his eyes locked with Karen's. She was standing there now, staring at him, clipboard still in hand. The brief exchange of glances made his heart skip a beat. There was something in the way she looked at him, calculating, critical. And then she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, but one that sent an unsettling wave through him. She was watching, and she didn't seem like the type of person who left things to chance. James climbed out of the pool, drying off quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The peace he'd come to love here was slipping away, and in its place was a growing tension. Karen's presence, now more than just a passing figure, seemed to hang over him like a dark cloud. As he gathered his things and walked toward the gate, he glanced back at the pool. Karen was still watching, clipboard in hand, a silent sentinel over the once idyllic spot. The quiet afternoon was over, and a new chapter was beginning, one that promised to be anything but peaceful. James had no idea just how much things were about to change. The following days felt unnervingly different. What had once been a sanctuary of calm now had a cloud hanging over it. James found himself hesitating each time he approached the pool, the unsettling thought of Karen's watchful eyes lingering in the back of his mind. It wasn't that anything drastic had happened yet, but there was something about the air, like a storm that hadn't yet broken, but you could feel it coming. One warm afternoon, James arrived after work, eager to unwind. He was met by an unexpected sight. A new sign-up sheet posted by the entrance, a gleaming white paper pinned to the notice board. Pool reservations required for use. Please respect your time slot. It read, the font neat but commanding. His heart sank as he read the bold lettering. Karen was at the poolside, clipboard in hand, offering her signature smile that never quite reached her eyes. James approached, trying to keep his irritation in check. "What's this about?" he asked, gesturing toward the sign-up sheet. "Just a small change," she said, her voice oozing sweetness that felt anything but kind. Karen's eyes sparkled with a strange satisfaction, as though the rule was already hers to impose. "We need to keep things organized. Make sure no one's taking up the space unnecessarily. You know, the usual." James stared at her, barely able to hide his disbelief. He had never had to reserve his spot in the pool before. He had always shown up after work, when the place was mostly empty, a peaceful haven. The idea of signing up for a pool slot now felt ridiculous, but Karen seemed determined, her gaze unwavering. "You know," she continued, as if reading his thoughts, "if we don't keep track of these things, it can lead to chaos." She nodded toward a small group of kids nearby, happily splashing in the shallow end. James knew Karen was talking about them, her eyes narrowing slightly as she surveyed the fun they were having. The pool had always been a place for neighbors to relax, but Karen made it feel more like a public office, scrutinizing even the most trivial matters. James took a deep breath. "I see," he said, trying to remain calm. "So now we need to make reservations for everything?" he asked, his voice laced with an edge he hadn't intended. Karen's smile remained fixed. "Exactly. It's for everyone's benefit." She turned her attention back to her clipboard, scribbling something down. James, now thoroughly annoyed, walked away, but not before casting one last look at her. She was already crossing things off her list as if she were marking scores in some twisted game, and James suddenly realized she wasn't just managing a pool, she was managing everybody. The next day, the reservation system felt even more suffocating. James swam for a few minutes, trying to forget the strange new rules. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the pool, once a place of freedom, was becoming a place of regulation, the fun slowly squeezed out of it. He overheard a conversation between a couple of other residents, who grumbled about the new restrictions. "This is ridiculous. I've never had to reserve a time to swim," one of them said, clearly annoyed. "The HOA is taking things too far." James overheard the words, and a flicker of hope passed through him. Maybe he wasn't alone in feeling this way. But just as quickly as it came, the thought was replaced by doubt. Who would stand up against Karen? She had made it clear she had the backing of the board, and the power to enforce whatever rules she saw fit. That night, as James lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about how things had changed. The pool was no longer the carefree escape he had once known. Karen had turned it into something else entirely, a place of control. He could feel the unseen walls closing in, making everything feel more like a trap than an oasis. His mind raced as he recalled how she had seemed so pleased with herself when she handed out the new rules, her smirk never faltering. She was too comfortable in her power, too certain of her ability to reshape things however she wanted. But he knew, deep down, that he couldn't let this slide. If everyone quietly accepted these changes, it wouldn't be long before they'd lose even more of their freedom. The thought made his blood boil. Karen was playing a game, and he was starting to realize the stakes were much higher than just a pool reservation. He closed his eyes and imagined the water once again, calm, inviting, and free. It had always been a place to escape, but now it was a battleground. And James felt the first stirrings of something inside him. He wouldn't let her win, not without a fight. Tomorrow, he would do something. He had to. James could no longer ignore the sinking feeling that had taken root in his gut. Each day, it seemed like Karen's influence over the pool, And the community was growing. Her rules weren't just petty inconveniences anymore. They were reshaping the very fabric of the place. The pool, once a sanctuary for relaxation, was now a choreographed space dictated by her every whim. One evening, James arrived at the pool, ready to claim his reserved spot. He had carefully followed the new sign-up procedure, choosing the perfect time slot after work. But as he reached the gate, his pulse quickened. Karen was there again, clipboard in hand, her eyes sweeping over the pool like a hawk eyeing prey. "Oh, James, I'm glad you're here," Karen's voice called out, smooth but sharp. She had this way of making even the most casual greeting sound like an accusation. James felt his stomach tighten. "Everything all right?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though he could feel the tension building inside him. "Oh, it's just a small issue," she said, her smile too perfect, like a mask. She gestured toward the far side of the pool, where a group of teenagers were laughing and chatting, their voices rising above the usual hum of poolside tranquility. "They're a little too loud for the evening, don't you think?" James raised an eyebrow. The group hadn't been bothering anyone. They were just hanging out, enjoying their time as young people do. It wasn't anything disruptive, but Karen was watching them with a cold intensity, her eyes flicking between the group and the clipboard, as if she were measuring their every move. "Karen," he said, his voice low but firm, "they're just having fun. It's no big deal." She tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "It's about respecting the space, James. We can't allow chaos to reign here. Everyone needs to follow the rules." Her voice was soft, but it had an edge to it, cold and precise, like she was speaking to a misbehaving child rather than a fellow adult. James stared at her, a knot tightening in his chest. The sense of unease was growing into something much more oppressive. This was about control, not rules. He could see it now, plain as day. Karen wasn't trying to make the pool better. She was using it to assert her dominance over the entire community. She wanted to dictate how everyone spent their time, and she was doing it one rule at a time. As James watched her turn her focus back to the group, he could see the shift in the air. It wasn't just about the noise. It was about Karen testing the limits, flexing her authority. James felt like he was witnessing the slow, creeping takeover of something sacred. The pool was no longer a place of community. It was becoming a space where freedom was being squeezed out, one regulation at a time. But what happened next made his blood run cold. Karen approached the group, her steps calculated, her eyes locked on the teenagers. She stood tall in front of them, her voice carrying across the pool, sharp and piercing. "Excuse me," she said, her words laced with authority. "I've already warned you about the noise level. If you can't respect the quiet hours, I'll have to ask you to leave." James froze, his heart pounding. The group looked at Karen, confusion and frustration crossing their faces. They hadn't been disruptive, not by any stretch. Yet Karen was using the power she now held to silence them, to bend them to her will. It was a show of force, plain and simple. The teenagers muttered under their breath, visibly upset, but they gathered their things and left. James clenched his fists. It wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about humiliating people. The power Karen had over the pool, over the community, was intoxicating. She could wield it like a weapon, and she did so without hesitation. As the group walked off, Karen turned and caught James' eye. A slow smile spread across her face, one that made his skin crawl. She knew what she was doing, and she enjoyed it. It wasn't enough to simply be in charge. She needed to see people submit, to watch as they obeyed her every word. James felt something snap inside him. He had come to this pool to relax, to escape. But now, he couldn't ignore the oppressive weight of Karen's control. She was turning a peaceful retreat into a battlefield, where the cost of freedom was high, and only the strong-willed could survive. He glanced around, seeing other residents retreating from the pool, avoiding eye contact as if they were afraid of getting caught in the crossfire of her wrath. Karen had made her mark, and it was clear that no one was exempt from her authority. James clenched his jaw, watching her stand tall, proud of her victory. But something inside him had changed. This was no longer just about a pool or a set of rules. It was a fight for control, and James wasn't about to back down. He walked away, his mind racing, formulating a plan. Karen had pushed too far. He wouldn't let her get away with it. Not this time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the pool, James felt a new resolve settling in his chest. The pool might be hers for now, but it wouldn't be for long. The fight was just beginning. James knew the stakes were rising, and the clock was ticking. Every day, it felt like the weight of Karen's influence was pressing harder on the community. It wasn't just about her controlling the pool anymore. It was about her asserting control over every little aspect of the residents' lives. And with each new rule, the tension in the air grew thicker. As the days passed, James began to notice something that disturbed him even more than the constant flow of new regulations. It wasn't just the pool that Karen had started micromanaging. It was everything. From parking spaces to landscaping choices, she seemed to be making her mark on every corner of the neighborhood. One evening, while walking past the pool on his way home, James noticed Karen once again standing at the entrance, clipboard in hand. She was inspecting the pool area with a level of scrutiny that made it feel like a military inspection, not a casual community gathering. A few residents milled about in the background, but they looked tense, eyes averted, walking on eggshells. As he approached, he heard her voice, crisp and sharp, as she scolded a couple for having their towels out of place. "This isn't a hotel, you know," she snapped, as though this minor offense was the end of the world. The couple nodded hastily, their faces red with embarrassment. The once vibrant social poolside had turned into an intimidating space, filled with the palpable fear of Karen's judgment. James clenched his fists. This wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was about Karen's need to control. He could see how she wielded power over others with a cold, calculated ease. Every person who walked through that gate felt like they were walking into a trap. Her smile, the fake kind that never quite reached her eyes, made it clear that she wasn't trying to improve anything. She was asserting dominance. That night, James found himself lying awake in bed, his mind running on overdrive. He could feel the weight of the situation settling in around him. He couldn't just sit idly by and let Karen continue to take control. Not when people's lives were being shaped by her whims. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the pool was only the beginning. If he didn't do something soon, it would be just a matter of time before Karen started imposing her rules on every aspect of the community and beyond. But he couldn't act recklessly. He needed to be careful, strategic. Karen wasn't just some overzealous neighbor. She was cunning, and she had the full backing of the HOA board behind her. The residents were growing increasingly wary of her, but they were too scared to speak out. They needed someone to lead them, someone who wasn't afraid to take on Karen and her relentless grip on the community. James realized he had to organize. He had to build a coalition of residents who were equally fed up with Karen's reign. But he couldn't do it alone. He began quietly approaching a few trusted neighbors, those who had already expressed their frustration but were too timid to make a move. The first one he spoke to was Tom, an older gentleman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Tom was a quiet man, known for his peaceful demeanor, but even he couldn't ignore the changes Karen was making. When James told him about his plan to challenge Karen's authority, Tom looked around cautiously, as if checking to see who might be listening. "I've had enough of her, James," Tom said in a hushed tone, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "She's making this place miserable. I'm with you, but you have to be smart. She'll tear you apart if you give her any reason." James nodded, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. "I know, Tom. But I'm done letting her run things with fear. We have to act before she takes more. The pool's just the start." Over the next few days, James continued to build his quiet alliance. He spoke to a handful of other residents who were fed up with the constant restrictions and Karen's ever-growing list of demands. One by one, they agreed to help, sharing stories of the ways Karen had made their lives more difficult. They all had something to lose, but they also had something in common: the desire to take back their community. They began meeting late at night, in the shadows of their homes, planning their next move. Every conversation was laced with a quiet urgency. James knew they had to be discreet. If Karen suspected anything, she would immediately shut them down. Her influence was everywhere now. James' heart raced as he listened to the complaints and frustrations of his neighbors. Each story confirmed what he already knew: Karen had overstepped her bounds. But what was more important now was the strategy. They needed a way to expose her for what she truly was: not just a busybody with a clipboard, but a power-hungry dictator whose influence was poisoning their community. James put together a plan. The next HOA meeting would be their chance to take action. Armed with evidence of Karen's overreach, they would make their voices heard and demand that she be removed from her position. But it wasn't going to be easy. Karen had a loyal following, and the HOA board wasn't as innocent as they appeared. But James was resolute. He couldn't wait any longer. He would make sure Karen's reign of terror came to an end, no matter the cost. As he sat in his room that night, staring at his phone and the quiet messages from his allies, he felt a sense of anticipation build within him. The battle had begun. And this time, it wasn't just for the pool. It was for the soul of the community itself. The tension was palpable, and the next move would change everything. The day of the HOA meeting had finally arrived, and the air felt thick with anticipation. James woke up early, his mind already racing through the strategy he carefully crafted over the past week. He had everything in place: the evidence of Karen's overreach, the testimonies from his neighbors, and the unwavering support of those who were sick of living in fear. Today was the day they would take action. As the clock ticked closer to the start of the meeting, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was a pivotal moment, not just for the pool, but for everything that had been slowly slipping away under Karen's rule. The community had grown tense, everyone quietly watching, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. James wasn't just fighting for a peaceful pool anymore. He was fighting for the spirit of the neighborhood itself. The meeting was set to take place in the small community center, a building that had always been used for harmless events, block parties, neighborhood barbecues, and the occasional town hall. But tonight, it felt like a battlefield. Residents filed into the room, some looking uneasy, others defiant, but everyone knew that things would never be the same after tonight. James took a seat near the back, his eyes scanning the room. A few familiar faces nodded at him, but most were quiet, clearly not sure what to expect. The long table at the front of the room was already set up with the HOA board members, and there, sitting at the head, was Karen. Her posture was flawless, her expression cool and confident, as though she were already preparing to win the battle she had waged over the last few weeks. James couldn't help but notice how perfect she looked, as though she had practiced this moment in front of a mirror 1,000 times. She was the epitome of authority, polished, composed, and ready to silence anyone who dared question her. The meeting began as usual, with Karen taking the floor first. She smiled at the crowd, her voice warm but clipped. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending. I'd like to start by addressing a few changes we've made to improve the neighborhood. As always, I'm working to ensure our community remains peaceful, organized, and most importantly, safe." James felt a ripple of frustration run through him as she spoke. She made everything sound so simple, so benign, but beneath the surface, her words were carefully crafted to disguise the tight grip she was holding over everything. One by one, she rattled off the new rules and regulations she had implemented: new parking restrictions, tighter rules for pool usage, increased surveillance for common areas. Each new improvement was met with hesitant applause, as if the residents were too afraid to speak up against her authority. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of her voice, every word a reminder of the control she was exerting. But now it was time. James had spent days gathering evidence, speaking with residents, and organizing a plan that would challenge Karen's grip. His allies were ready. Tom, Becca, and a few others had all agreed to stand up with him and share their experiences. As Karen finished her speech, James felt a surge of adrenaline. He stood, his voice clear and unwavering. "I'd like to speak now," he said, his words cutting through the murmur of the room. The eyes of every resident turned toward him, some curious, some anxious, but they were all watching. James stepped forward, his hand steady, his heart pounding in his chest. "Thank you, Karen, for your presentation," he began, keeping his tone respectful but firm. "However, I believe it's time for us to have a real conversation about the direction our community is headed." A few people nodded, their faces lit with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Karen's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment he thought he saw a brief flash of annoyance. But she kept her composure, offering him a polite smile. "James, I appreciate your thoughts," Karen said smoothly. "But as president of the HOA, I've worked hard to ensure this neighborhood remains organized and orderly. I think we can all agree these changes have been for the best." "Organized," James echoed, his voice rising with passion. "Organized is one thing, Karen, but what you're doing here is stifling the very essence of our community. You're turning our homes into places where fear reigns. You're using your position to impose unnecessary rules, to control our every move." The room went silent. James felt every eye on him, some startled, others tense. Karen's smile faltered, just for a second, before she regained her composure. Her eyes narrowed, but she remained calm. "I'm only trying to make things better for everyone," Karen said, her voice like ice. "I'm sure you can understand that." "I understand more than you think," James replied, stepping closer to the table, his voice firm. "But it's not about making things better. It's about control. You've made it clear that you'll stop at nothing to manage every aspect of our lives, and that's not what this community is supposed to be about." His words hung in the air, thick with truth and challenge. For a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. Karen's carefully crafted image was cracking, the walls she had built around herself starting to show signs of strain. "We've had enough." Becca's voice cut in from the back, surprising everyone. She stood up, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "We're not your puppets, Karen. We don't need to live under your thumb. It's time for a change." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and suddenly, more residents stood. Tom, an elderly couple, a few others who had remained silent until now. James looked around the room, feeling the tide begin to turn. They were with him. They were ready to fight for their home, for their freedom. Karen's face hardened, and the smile that had once seemed so confident now looked more like a mask. She stood, slowly, her eyes flashing with fury. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her voice cold. "I've worked tirelessly to improve this community. And now you're turning this into a spectacle." "I'm turning this into a stand for what's right," James said, meeting her glare. "And we're done waiting for you to fix everything. You're the one who's out of line, Karen. It's time for you to go." The room fell into a tense silence as the battle lines were drawn. This was no longer just a conversation. It was a battle for the soul of the neighborhood. And James had no intention of backing down. The tension in the room was palpable as the residents stood their ground, uniting against the oppressive reign of Karen. Her face, once a portrait of calm control, now betrayed the cracks in her facade. She stood frozen for a moment, her eyes flashing with barely contained fury. The atmosphere was charged, like the calm before a storm. "You think this is a game?" Karen finally said, her voice low and dangerous, like a rattlesnake poised to strike. Her gaze swept over the crowd, her eyes narrowing with venom. "You really want to challenge me, James? You think you can tear down everything I've worked for?" James held her gaze, unwavering, his resolve firming like steel. It's not about tearing anything down, Karen. It's about restoring the balance. You've crossed a line, and the people here are finally waking up to it. Her face turned an icy shade of pale as the room erupted in murmurs of agreement. James could feel the collective shift. The balance had tipped. No longer would Karen's authoritarian rule go unchallenged. But her pride and arrogance weren't going to let this go without a fight. I'm not going to stand here and let you disrespect me or my work, Karen spat, her tone now tinged with desperation. She slammed her hand down on the table, causing the room to fall silent once again. You think you can just organize a revolt and get away with it? You have no idea who you're up against. James' eyes remained locked on hers. He could see the cracks in her composure now, the fear beneath her icy facade. She was losing control, and that made her dangerous. Let me make one thing clear, Karen, he said, his voice sharp. This isn't just about you and me. This is about the community you've divided, the friendships you've strained, the trust you've broken. You've made this neighborhood a place of fear, not camaraderie. You're not invincible. The room was still now, hanging on every word, every breath. For a moment, Karen's expression faltered, her lips tightening as she fought to maintain her grip on the situation. But then, like a cornered animal, she lashed out. You'll regret this, James. You have no idea what you're starting. This won't end well for you. The threat hung in the air, but James wasn't intimidated. He had already made up his mind. His eyes swept across the room, meeting the eyes of his allies. Becca, Tom, and the others who had stood with him in this quiet rebellion. The support from the residents was growing stronger by the second, and James could feel the momentum building. Karen took a deep breath, visibly forcing herself to calm down. Fine, she said, her voice colder than ever. But this isn't over. You've made your choice, and I'll make mine. Let's see how far you're willing to take this. The meeting continued, but the mood had shifted. The once polished facade of Karen's rule was shattered, and the true nature of the battle was now on display for all to see. The residents had witnessed the cracks in her armor, and they weren't about to let her off the hook. The next day, James woke up early the next morning, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. The night had been filled with heated debates and accusations, but the ultimate victory had been clear. The people were waking up, and Karen's grip on the community was no longer as secure as it had been. But Karen wasn't one to back down easily, and James knew this fight was far from over. The morning after the HOA meeting, he received a call from Tom. His voice was grim, and James could hear the tension in his words. James, you need to know this, Tom said, his voice low. Karen's already calling in reinforcements. She's reaching out to the HOA board, and they're planning to hold an emergency meeting. She's not just going to accept this loss. She's gearing up for round 2, and she's going to pull out all the stops. James felt his stomach churn. Karen had power. She wasn't about to let this slip through her fingers without a fight. But the thought of backing down never even crossed his mind. It was time to push harder, to dig deeper. The battle lines had been drawn, and this fight was far from over. Thanks for the heads up, Tom, James replied, his mind already racing. Let her bring in whoever she wants. We'll be ready for them. That afternoon, word spread quickly that Karen was mobilizing her forces. Members of the HOA board loyal to her, some of the more affluent residents who had never questioned her authority. They were preparing to strike back, to reassert her control over the neighborhood. But James wasn't intimidated. This was no longer about a pool or petty rules. This was about reclaiming their neighborhood, their freedom. In the coming days, James rallied his allies once again, making sure they had all the information they needed to counter Karen's attack. He reached out to other residents who had kept quiet in the past, urging them to join the cause. Each conversation brought a new wave of support, and the movement was gaining strength. The stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about being able to use the pool. It was about proving that the community belonged to the people, not to an overbearing tyrant. Karen had underestimated them, And now, she would see what happens when the residents of a community finally decide they've had enough. James stared out his window, watching as the sun dipped low in the sky. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they might just win this war. The next confrontation loomed on the horizon, and it was going to be a fight that would decide the future of the neighborhood. James was ready for it, and he would not back down. The days following the HOA meeting were filled with a heightened sense of urgency. James knew that Karen wasn't going to take this challenge lying down. If anything, she'd double down on her power, pulling every string and every favor she could to regain control. The neighborhood felt different now, like the air before a storm. Everyone could sense it. The calm had shattered, and the fight was escalating. This wasn't just about the pool anymore. This was about ownership, who truly had the power to shape their community. James spent every waking moment strategizing with his allies. He and Tom were going through every bit of evidence they had collected, ensuring they were armed with undeniable proof of Karen's overreach. Becca had rallied support from several more residents, those who had quietly grown resentful of Karen's grip, but had been too afraid to speak up. The momentum was building, and James could feel the tide beginning to turn in their favor. One night, after hours of discussion, they finalized their plan. The HOA board's emergency meeting was scheduled for the following evening, and it would be the perfect time to make their move. James and his team would present their evidence, countering Karen's claims of order with real examples of how she had overstepped her bounds. They had witnesses, real stories from residents who had suffered under her rules. The stage was set. The day of the showdown. The evening of the emergency meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was thick. The community center was bustling with activity as residents filed in, some nervous, others eager for the confrontation that had been building for weeks. Karen's loyal followers sat in one corner of the room, casting cold glares at anyone who dared to look their way. Karen herself stood near the front, flanked by a few board members who were clearly backing her. She wore that same polished, perfect expression, calm, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew this might be the end of her reign. James stood at the back of the room, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and anxiety. His allies were positioned around the room, ready to step up when the time came. This was it. There was no turning back now. The meeting began with Karen stepping up to the microphone, her voice as smooth and controlled as always. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "As you all know, I called this emergency meeting to address the recent disruptions to our peaceful community. We've made great strides, and it's important that we continue down the path of order and safety for all residents." James could already feel the rising anger within him, but he knew this was his moment to speak up. He couldn't afford to let her win by staying silent. He took a deep breath and stood. The room seemed to hold its breath as he made his way to the front, facing the HOA board, but his eyes were locked on Karen. "I'm not here to disrupt, Karen," James said loudly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "I'm here to restore the peace you've destroyed. What you call order, we see as oppression. You've twisted your power to control every aspect of this neighborhood, when it was never your place to do so." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The eyes of the room were fixed on James, who now stood confidently at the front. He could feel the tide shifting as more and more residents shifted their weight in their seats, preparing to listen. Karen's jaw tightened. "James," she said with forced calm, "this is unacceptable. You've been warned, and now you're making this personal. You're jeopardizing the entire foundation of our community." "Personal?" James raised an eyebrow. "Karen, it's personal when someone's using fear to control the lives of others. It's personal when families can't enjoy something as simple as a community pool without you watching over them like a hawk. It's personal when your improvements are only making this neighborhood a place where we walk on eggshells." The room was completely silent now. James had struck a nerve. He could see Karen's facade starting to crack, her cool demeanor slipping as the weight of his words sank in. He continued, his voice unwavering. "We've collected evidence of your overreach," James said, his eyes scanning the room. "Your rules, your surveillance, your manipulation of the HOA board to push through your personal agenda. It's all here. You've turned a place of belonging into a prison, Karen, and we won't stand for it anymore." From behind him, Becca stepped forward, holding a thick folder filled with testimonies and documentation. "I have spoken with the residents," she said, her voice strong, "and they are tired of living in fear of your next rule. This isn't just about the pool. This is about our homes, our families, and our ability to live freely." James nodded in agreement, feeling the weight of the community behind him. He was no longer fighting alone. One by one, other residents stepped forward, their voices rising in unison. They all had stories to tell: the impossible parking rules, the unsolicited inspections of their yards, the constant stream of new regulations that infringed on their basic freedoms. Karen's face was white with rage now, her eyes darting around the room, looking for someone to back her up, but the support she'd once relied on was fading. More residents were siding with James, their frustration and fear transformed into defiance. They no longer saw a tyrant in charge. They saw a woman who had manipulated her position for far too long. "I'm sorry, Karen," one of the residents said, standing tall. "But the people have spoken. You've lost your influence here. It's time for a change." Karen stood frozen, her eyes flashing with pure fury, but there was nothing she could do. The community had turned against her. She had overplayed her hand, and now, the people who once cowered beneath her rule had found their voices. "We're voting tonight," James said, his voice resolute. "And the vote is simple. Do we continue to live under your control, or do we take back our community?" A murmur ran through the room, the residents whispering among themselves. But it was clear, this wasn't just a battle for the pool. This was a fight for their homes, for their rights, and for the future of the neighborhood. The vote would change everything. The final decision. The votes were cast, the room holding its breath as the tally was announced. The result was clear, undeniable, and a victory for the people. Karen's reign was over, and with her departure, a new era for the neighborhood was born. The battle had been won. But the true victory lay in what came next, a community united, stronger, and free from the chains of fear. The air in the community center was thick with the weight of the decision that had just been made. Karen's reign had ended, and the room was alive with a mix of emotions: relief, triumph, and a sense of solidarity that hadn't been felt in years. The community that had once been divided by fear and control was now coming together, united by a single cause. James stood at the front, his heart pounding with the realization that they had done it. They had taken back their neighborhood. As the votes were counted, James exchanged glances with Becca, Tom, and the others who had fought beside him. Their eyes gleamed with victory, but there was also a quiet understanding among them. This battle had been hard-fought, but it was just the beginning. The work ahead would take dedication, and they were ready. The final tally was announced with a loud, clear voice. The vote is unanimous. The motion to remove Karen from her position as HOA president has passed. Effective immediately, she will no longer hold any authority over this community. A collective cheer erupted from the residents, some standing, clapping, while others simply exhaled in relief. The moment they had all been waiting for had arrived. But even in the celebration, there was a realization that change wouldn't happen overnight. This was just the first step in reclaiming their neighborhood, in ensuring that no one would ever again abuse their power for personal gain. James felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Tom beside him, a proud smile on his face. "We did it, man," he said, voice heavy with satisfaction. "I never thought I'd see the day. Karen's out. This place is ours again." James nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. "It's not just about Karen being gone," he said quietly. "It's about ensuring that the community comes first. We need to keep it that way. No one person should ever have that much control again." As the crowd began to disperse, a sense of renewal filled the air. The pool, which had been at the heart of this entire struggle, now felt like a symbol of their victory, a place where freedom and unity would once again reign. No longer would it be a battleground of rules and restrictions. It would be a space for the people to gather, to enjoy, and to take back what had once been theirs. The new era. In the days that followed, the community began to heal. Karen's departure from the HOA had left a noticeable void, and while some of her former supporters were still lingering, their influence was weakening. The new board, which James had helped to shape, was determined to ensure that the voices of the residents remained strong and united. The first act of the new board was simple but powerful. They officially lifted the oppressive pool rules that Karen had implemented. The pool, once a place of anxiety and division, became a true community hub once again. Families gathered there without fear of reprimand, children played freely, and neighbors shared stories in the warm summer sun. It was everything James had hoped for and more. Becca had taken up the role of the new community liaison, working closely with the residents to ensure their voices were heard and respected. She'd taken to organizing neighborhood events, barbecues, movie nights, and cleanup days that allowed the residents to reconnect and rebuild the sense of belonging that had been lost. The fear that had once gripped the community was replaced with a shared sense of empowerment and pride. The legacy of change. James sat by the pool one evening, his feet dipped into the cool water, watching the neighborhood come alive around him. People were talking, laughing, and enjoying the freedom they had fought for. His thoughts drifted back to the long nights of planning, the difficult moments of doubt, and the ultimate victory they had achieved together. This wasn't just about winning a battle against Karen. It was about creating something sustainable, something that would last. A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Becca approached, holding 2 cold drinks in her hands. She handed one to James and sat beside him, her eyes scanning the pool area with a look of contentment. "It feels different, doesn't it?" she said softly. James took a sip of his drink and nodded. "It does. For the first time in a long while, it feels like we're actually in charge of this place again. Not just the pool, but the whole community. We have to make sure it stays this way." Becca smiled. "I think we will. We've shown that when people come together, they can make a difference, and we're not going to let that go." James looked around at the faces of his neighbors, smiling and chatting, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had won this fight not through force, but through unity. Together, they had reclaimed their home, and it was stronger than ever. This was the beginning of something new, a neighborhood where everyone had a voice and a place. As the sun set on that peaceful evening, the sound of laughter filled the air. The pool shimmered under the soft glow of the lights, a symbol of their collective victory. James knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for now, as the community celebrated, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle had been won, and the future was theirs to shape. The community was finally free.